Grr. Hey dolls, it's me, Wilma Fingerdoo, with another Makeup and Movies. This week, the makeup is from Likely Makeup here in Canada, based out of British Columbia, the Ugly palette, and it is anything but, let me tell you what. The best thing about this palette, Canadian. I didn't have to wait 400 years for it to get delivered to my door. This week's movie is the 1939 classic, and one of my most requested movies for Makeup and Movies, The Women, directed by George Cukor, starring Norma, Shearer, Joan Crawford, Rosalind Russell, just to name three. This is an all-female cast, right down to the extras, the animals, the writers. Women, women, women. So, if you'd like to learn more about this 1939 star-studded classic and watch me do this to myself, stay tuned! Okay, so the makeup, as per usual, I have my Juvia's Place foundation, I have my Juvia's Place shade sticks for contour, I also use my Juvia's Place White Sands setting powder. I don't use it for my initial set, though. I just use Coty Airspun, original, like just that first setting of all this. I use the Coty, but everything after that I use Juvia's Place White Sand because it's just a lighter, finer milled powder and it just doesn't settle into creases as much. I also have on the Juvia's Place concealer. I really like this. The thing is though, and trust me on this, you have got to shake this. Everybody who ever uses this on camera the first time squirts water all over their face and their eye, on their hand, wherever. Shake this. In fact, I shake everything before I put it on. I don't know how long it's been sitting there sometimes. Do you know what I mean? So that's just it. The palette that I'm using today is from Likely Cosmetics. It is the Ugly palette. Now, the reason I'm using this particularly today is this company is Canadian. They are from British Columbia in Canada, but if you go to their website as an American, it's all done in US dollars, which sucks if you're Canadian because, but at least the nice thing was this palette got to me in under a week. There was no surprise duty fees. There was no surprise wait at borders. None of that. It literally got to my house. And now I know what Americans feel like when they order stuff within America. But this is the Ugly palette. It looks like a rainbow palette out of the gate, but it's actually a really well curated palette. We have all shimmers on the bottom row. A pink, green, chartreusey green, a very light blue, and a very, very accessible yellow. You heard me. Drag queen name in high school. The thing I love about this, not a lot of neutrals. There's not a lot of browns, not a lot of unnecessary colors. This is just for an eye look. The only real brown color is the shade Ugliest. It's a very brown, very boring color in theory, but it's actually a really great depth tone in here because it's not black. So you're going to get some nice depth out of that color. You can also, I'll use this on my eyebrows for sure. The movie, this is my most requested movie, The Women from 1939. I've had more people ask me to do this particular review than almost any other movie. And this is a classic. Now, I'm just going to be right out front here and say to you, I'm not a huge fan of this movie, and it's not because it's a bad movie. I mean, I think that a lot of people would say it is a bad movie by today's standards, because, you know, it's 1939. The acting is a little broad. The script is a little two-dimensional. The concepts that we're dealing with from 1939 are very antiquated, very sexist. Now, you keep in mind, this is right in between the Depression and World War II. I think the greatest thing about this movie is its cast, because it's a real time capsule of actors of this time, specifically female actors. Now, I'm going to be honest with you and say right out of the gate, I'm not familiar with most of the cast. My favorite in this movie is definitely Rosalind Russell. The other actors in it that I know or knew of already, Joan Crawford. Marjorie Main, she was in all of the Ma and Pa Kettle movies. So really, this film is a great jumping off point if you're doing any kind of deep dive into the history of Hollywood, especially because Norma, Shearer, and Joan Crawford were stars in the silent film era. They really were some of the few people that translated into talkies. Now, This movie was based on the 1936 play by the same name that was written by Claire Booth Luce. And it was adapted by Anita Loos and Jane Murfin, although I don't see a lot of Jane Murfin's name coming up in a lot of the development of this film. Not to say that Jane didn't do anything, but it seems to me that Anita Loos was a little more instrumental in getting this film made, or at least from the stage to the screen. Even though this film was written in 1936, it was a play, and plays were just given a different consideration than movies. The Hays Code, or the production code for films, was in full swing by the 1939, but they were really very strict with what could and couldn't be said in this movie, and there was a lot of tweaking that had to go on. I don't know if it had been a movie about men. I don't know if the production code would have been as harsh. Maybe it would have. I don't know. Apparently, Anita Loos had to do a lot of changes from the actual script to allow a lot of the dialogue on TV. I mean, sorry, on the movie. And in fact, what ended up happening was that she sat next to George Cukor on set while they were filming, and in a lot of cases, ad-libbed lines between them to throw into the movie. Because a lot of the jokes in this movie and a lot of the dialogue had to do, it was very hypersexualized. You know, it's a bunch of women talking about a bunch of men, and the men aren't around. So, as you can imagine, the dialogue became very specific. Men were concerned, I'm assuming. I don't know. I've not read the play. As I said, the director for this movie was George Cukor, who was an openly secret homosexual. At this time in Hollywood, I think a lot of people were openly gay within the community they worked in. I mean, certainly they all knew who was who, but it wasn't common knowledge. Like, it wasn't like people walked down the street on their way to work talking about George Cukor and his homosexuality. He has the distinction, George Cukor, of being the first director to be fired off of Gone with the Wind. I think that there was 5 definitely, but there was, I think, 7 or 8 that kind of got pulled through the mill. And the interesting thing about this is that Gone with the Wind was filmed before the women, but it was released after. The women got released first. And the minute that George Cukor became available to direct the women, there was a producer, Hunt Stromberg. He immediately made a beeline to George to say, please direct this movie. Now, it's probably because he was gay, but he was actually referred to as the woman whisperer as far as directors went. He had a reputation for being able to direct women. Now, for those of you who don't know who George Cukor is, he won an Oscar. I think it's his only Oscar for My Fair Lady in 1964. But he also directed Katharine Hepburn and Spencer Tracy in Adam's Rib in 1949. He directed Judy Holliday in her Oscar-winning performance in Born Yesterday. And he did the 1954 remake of A Star is Born with Judy Garland, which is interesting because he had actually turned down directing the original. He didn't like the script. But I guess because, A, it was Judy Garland, who was a friend of his, but also the remake was a musical. The original wasn't a musical. In fact, the lead actor in the 1937 version of A Star is Born is just an actor. I think almost every remake of A Star is Born since, Judy Garland, Barbra Streisand, Lady Gaga, have all been about singers, not actors. Speaking of Judy Garland, he also spent a week working on The Wizard of Oz. He didn't actually film anything. I guess it was in the early stages of The Wizard of Oz, but he made some big decisions that affected how we see the movie today. For instance, I think initially Judy Garland was because keep in mind that this film was originally meant for uh, Shirley Temple. So originally Judy Garland was to be blonde in the movie. They had a blonde wig and everything worked out for her. And he nixed that and let her be a brunette. He also softened the Scarecrow's makeup. Apparently the Scarecrow's makeup was quite, I guess, heavy-handed or harsh. And so he was instrumental in them changing that. He also refined the look of the Wicked Witch and was the reason that they hired Jack Haley as the Tin Man. The original actor, who I can't remember, had an allergic reaction to the makeup, the silver makeup that they were using, and couldn't continue filming. I mean, clearly at that stage they were only doing camera tests. It was a busy week for Mr. Cooker, is all I'm saying. He also directed Maggie Smith in the Oscar-nominated 1972 film Travels with My Aunt, or at least she was nominated for an Oscar in it. And he also did Jacqueline Bisset and Candice Bergen in the 1981 film Rich and Famous. And I'm sure that was his last film. I'm not sure how soon after that he died, but it wasn't too long after that he died. But yeah, a very viable, contributive member of the Hollywood community, and certainly affecting a lot of the classics that we've all come to know since. Now, the plot of this film is the biggest problem for me. It's just the thing that I have the most trouble with, and it's because it's very antiquated. It's basically a film about divorce, which, is not a big deal now. But back then, back in the 30s, you still whispered it. So this is basically a film of a group of Manhattan women. They're all white. They're all rich. So completely unrelatable. But at the same time, keep in mind that this movie was made just at the end of the Depression and just before the war. So a lot of people were still trying to come out of the Depression. Movies were an escape. So people like to go to the movies to see situations and problems that weren't what they were dealing with themselves. So something that's interesting about this movie is there's no men in it. It's really a movie about women. And they talk about the fact that there was no men in this, like no male actors. In fact, when they are talking about any of the men, which are mostly husbands, any of the husbands, they're all either off camera or on the phone or just being referred to. Even, as I say, all of the extras, all of the bit parts walk on one line. Everybody's a woman. So basically what happens is Mary's cousin and friend, Sylvia Fowler, goes for a manicure and learns from the gossipy manicurist, Olga is her name, that Mary's husband has been stepping out with a salesgirl named Crystal Allen. Sylvia tells everyone but Mary, and then arranges for Mary to go and get a manicure from this woman. And of course, the Gabby manicurist starts talking about Stephen Haynes, not knowing that this woman is his wife. Well, she realizes that she's talking about her husband and rushes out. Her mother, typical to the period, gives her the advice of not doing anything. Don't jump to anything. Just here's what we'll do. Let's go on a trip to Bermuda so your husband can think things out. Because that's helped dozens of people always. But it doesn't help. And Mary ends up going and getting a divorce in Reno. While she's en route to Reno, there's a train that all the women are going to Reno on. And it's, I think that going to Reno for a divorce was so common within a certain class at that time that it was not surprising to see like more than a few women on the train to Reno type of thing. And so she goes to Reno, meets these women on the train, and they all end up at this dude ranch while they're waiting for their divorces to come through. One of the women there is having an affair with Sylvia Fowler's husband, played by Rosalind Russell, and she plans to marry him. Well, it proves true when Sylvia herself shows up at this dude ranch to wait for her divorce to come through. And she and this other woman end up having this huge knockdown fight. It's spectacular. And of course, is one of the highlights of the movie. So, of course, once Mary's divorce comes through, her husband informs her that he's married this shop girl, Crystal Allen, and she's played by Joan Crawford. And 2 years go by, and now Crystal Allen is finding that being married isn't all it's cracked up to be. Surprise, surprise. And true to form, she's started having a new affair with another man, which, of course, gossipy Sylvia Fowler finds out about, and of course tells everybody. So the whole movie culminates in all of the characters ending up at this supper club, like a restaurant, and they're all in the ladies' lounge, where it's discovered that Crystal's having an affair with one of the other women's husbands. And so it all comes to a head. They more or less kick Crystal out of their genteel social circle. Crystal realizes she's going back to the perfume counter, and all of a sudden Mary is very happy to reunite with her husband, who was the cause of all her troubles in the first place. See, this film is just not, it's hard to digest. You couldn't make this film today. No one would put up for it with it. Well, in fact, they did remake the film. Diane English, who created Murphy Brown, wrote the script and ended up directing the movie in 2008, but it took her 15 years to get the script to a point where she felt it was good enough to film. And I think by then there were a lot of just themes in the movie that weren't a big deal anymore. And I find myself, although I like the performances in it, Annette Bening, Deborah Messing, Meg Ryan, Candice Bergen was also in it. It was all right, but it wasn't better than the original. I think there's a nostalgia level with the original that makes it stand out. But in 1960, MGM was toying with the idea of doing an all-male cast of this film, basically the same storyline, but from, I guess, a man's point of view, or just involving the man. I don't really know. But the names that were bandied around, I mean, they didn't make this. And in fact, I don't even think they got to casting. But the names that got bandied around to be in this movie were Tab Hunter, Robert Wagner, James Garner. Jerry Mathers from Leave It to Beaver was supposed to play the child of the lead characters. And Ronald Reagan was supposed to be in it. Oh, a bug. Oh, I got it. Yay! I hate bugs. Ronald Reagan was supposed to be in it, and Troy Donahue. And if you don't know who any of those people are, then I guess it's a good thing they didn't make this movie. Just something else that's interesting about this movie that I think I should say now is just that this was one of Freddie Mercury's favorite movies. And again, I think because he was a gay man as well, the appeal of the dialogue, the women, the fabulousness of it all, I think that helped contribute to its appeal within the gay audience. I mean, as I say, I'm not a huge fan of this movie. I don't hate it, but I'm not a huge fan of it. But it's definitely you can see where a bunch of men would be throwing these quotes at each other all the time. One of the things that was interesting, the women kept referring to each other as Beazle. And a lot of people now think that that's a 1930s slang. It wasn't at all. It was made up. It was made up specifically to replace the word bitch, so that they could. This is one of the problems with the censors, was they wouldn't allow these women to call each other bitch on camera, and so they had to create a whole new word for them. I just find hilarious. Especially nowadays. I mean, back then, I can imagine what a chore it must have been. Well, you can't say that word. It's like, well, it's in every line. I also think it's worth saying right now that here's a film about women, by women, for women, and they're calling each other a bitch. So it's still interesting, I think, that those kind of things, you can't seem to get away from that. So, of course, there are a lot of great quotes in this movie. One of them is when Crystal and Mary kind of confront each other. They're at a salon. I guess Crystal's having a fitting for a corset or some such thing, and Mary makes some reference that, well, Stephen doesn't like his women to wear things like that. And Crystal says, well, if I ever find myself wearing something that Stephen doesn't approve of, I just take it off. There's a great line when the women are all in an exercise class and the instructor says, well, let's begin with posture. A lady always enters a room erect. And Rosalind Russell's character, Sylvia, says, most of my friends exit horizontally. One of the last great lines in the movie is when Crystal Allen is being kind of publicly dismissed from the group of women for being a homewrecker and a tramp. She says, there's a name for you ladies, but it isn't used in high society outside of a kennel. So that's as close, I think, as they got to the word bitch. Because it was an all-female cast, a lot of the gossip that ended up coming out of this movie was all about these women catfighting. A lot of reports said that the filming of this movie was fine. There wasn't a lot of that, but there were some issues. Norma Shearer, Joan Crawford, and Rosalind Russell were the three core women. They're from which the story all flows. And Rosalind Russell said in her biography, Life is a Banquet, that she had to play sick at the beginning of production because apparently Norma Shearer would not share top billing. She wanted top billing. It was her movie, and the rest could all go suck an egg. And so Rosalind Russell just pulled a Joan Crawford and played sick until she started whistling a new tune. But Norma Shearer, who plays Mary Haynes, was a silent picture star from like 1919 to 1928 at MGM. And the thing that I love about her is that she's a Canadian. She was born in Montreal. She ended up going to New York to work in theater and then working in movies. She won an Oscar for her performance in the 1930 film The Divorcee. She was also nominated for a bunch of Oscars for, in the same year, Their Own Desire, in 31 for Free Soul, in 34 for The Barretts of Wimpole Street, in 36 for Romeo and Juliet, and 39's Marie Antoinette. So a very big deal in Hollywood. The audience definitely would go see her in a movie because they already knew who she was. Another person who was a silent film star was Joan Crawford, and she played Crystal Allen. And she was a silent film actor with MGM from 1925 until 1929, but didn't really start to feature or star in movies until 1927. Joan Crawford continued her career in talkies. She was known for playing rags to riches characters where she was often, the maid or the shop girl or some such thing who then went on to make good. And of course, especially with the Depression era audience, that was a huge draw. She did over 30 films with MGM before she left and went to Warner Brothers. Right after she went to Warner Brothers in 1944, she won the Oscar for Mildred Pierce in 1945. So it was a good move for her. But the only thing was, going to Warner Brothers put her in direct competition with Bette Davis. And this isn't why the two of them didn't get along. Apparently they didn't get along before that, but it certainly did not help, I'm just going to say. The only reason that I do watch this movie, because she is so funny in it, is Rosalind Russell as Sylvia Fowler. Now, Rosalind Russell really does accredit George Cukor for her success in this movie, because keep in mind, her character is the protagonist. She's the reason her best friend finds out that her husband's having an affair. Like, she's not playing a very nice person. In fact, she's a bit of a homewrecker in that, she's the reason that all of these woes are being visited upon by Mary and some of the other women. And so he told her to play this character very broadly, just because it was she could have just come off as so unlikable as, the reason for all of this woe and misery. And as I say, because she played it broadly, I mean, it's worth watching this movie just to see her in it, because she just All of her line deliveries are out of the side of her face. She's very smug and quick, and one of those people like, ooh, like just very big, and it's just very funny. Rosalind Russell started her career as a model in New York and ended up doing theater and then moved into film. In fact, in the 30s, she was a contract player to Universal and then moved to MGM by the mid 30s, which is how she ended up doing The Women. Up until that point, she had been really kind of floating around the Hollywood circuit, filling in, here and there. Apparently, she was one of those actresses that if their first choice actor wasn't available or turned down a role, she was the one they all kind of went to until The Women. And then she just really created this reputation for herself as being a comedic actress. And it really was her breakout role and really established her career in Hollywood for the rest of her life. Another lead actor in The Women is Paulette Goddard, who I'm not very aware of. I mean, she plays Miriam Aarons, and she was a former child actor on Broadway, and also a Ziegfeld girl. She had a very good early career, and even though she was in this 1939 MGM film, she really didn't come into her own until the 40s when she moved to Universal. Her breakout role was the leading lady in her then boyfriend, Charlie Chaplin. She was actually dating. In fact, I think they even got married, but I don't think it was a public marriage. But she was married to him, and then they ended up divorcing. But while she was married to him or seeing him, he cast her in the lead of his film Modern Times. And then because of that success, she ended up signing to Zelnick Studios, and they're the ones who lent her out to MGM for The Women. And then after The Women, she ended up signing to Paramount, and that's when her career took off. Phyllis Pover was one of the actors that recreated her role from the original play, and after that, she went back into theater. She really didn't do that much, but she did do 2 more films. She did The Marrying Kind with Judy Holliday, and she did Pat and Mike with Katharine Hepburn and Spencer Tracy. And those 2 films were directed by George Cukor. So clearly, there was one man in the world that could actually lure her back to the silver screen, and it was George. Joan Fontaine played Peggy Day, and she's a former stage actress, and she is the younger sister of Olivia de Havilland, and their family name was de Havilland, and their mother's maiden name was Fontaine. So that's where Joan gets her last name. But she started her film career at RKO and had a series of small roles in a bunch of films, and she also got lent out to other movies, and that's how she ended up in The Women, because she wasn't with MGM for sure. But her big claim to fame was when she starred in the film Rebecca, which was Alfred Hitchcock, who was a British director. It was his first American film, and that was such a big hit that it definitely solidified her career anyway. Another actor that I want to make mention of, although I don't think many people would know her name, is Lucille Watson, and she played Mrs. Moorhead, who's Mary's mother in this cast. And the reason I bring this up is that she was also Canadian. She was born in Quebec and raised in Ottawa, and then moved to New York to study acting. She first starred on Broadway in 1902, and later was in the 1941 play Watch on the Rhine, and then later recreated that role for the 1943 film, which she was nominated for an Oscar. So there you go. Clearly a very talented group of people. Marjorie Main is another one of the characters in this, actors in this movie that I was aware of. She starred in all of those Ma and Pa Kettle films. Before that, she was in vaudeville and in theater. She performed with W.C. Fields. She played Mae West's mother, and she even performed opposite Barbara Stanwyck on stage. But her big break came in the 1935 play Dead End, where she played Babyface Martin's mother. And she was in that role. She did 460 performances before leaving that show to star in the 1936 role of Lucy in The Women on Broadway. So clearly she went from one hit to another hit to the film hit. So very much a well-deserved star of her time. One of my favorite people in this cast, though, is Butterfly Mcqueen. She has this small role where she's like the maid to the the perfume counter department where Joan Crawford's character works. But the thing that bothers me the most about her being in this movie is that she's uncredited. Now, lots of people in this play were uncredited, but they had less lines than her. She also is performing all of her scenes. If there's more than a couple, she was in at least one. They're with Joan Crawford. And she was also the maid in Mildred Pierce. She played Joan Crawford's maid in that movie, as well as playing Prissy in Gone with the Wind. And what's interesting is, as I said, George Cukor started out as the director for Gone with the Wind. So I feel that he could have very well been the reason that Butterfly Mcqueen was cast in Gone with the Wind. And then for her to then get cast in The Women by George makes a lot of sense to me anyway. It's interesting. But the thing that I liked about Butterfly Mcqueen was she really hated the fact that she thought, you know, as a woman of color in Hollywood, she had to play the maid once and then she would get moved up. And that wasn't the case. And she really hated the inequity of being a female woman of color in Hollywood and how limiting it was. So she went back to theater and then ended up on television. She won an Emmy for one of her TV movies. So, you know, good for Butterfly Mcqueen. She never compromised herself. One of the most interesting things about this movie, and I'm sure it was the 3D gimmick of its era, was that in the middle of the movie, there's a full 20-minute or 15-minute colored fashion show. It's all shot in color, and color film was still a bit of a novelty. So I'm sure that this scene was included in the movie just as a draw, but it featured the work of the actual film's fashion designer, Adrian. Adrian designed over 200 costumes for this film, and they were very, very high fashion, very modern. There was a real sense of the future in this because, as I said, the period was just after the Depression. And I guess society or the masses were demanding a new look across the board. And although when you look at this now and you see some of the fashions, it's very modern and maybe a bit risque or avant-garde for that period, for that decade, it was a time when all things futuristic were being embraced, from fashion to architecture. I mean, keep in mind, Art Deco was the still in vogue, but sadly, it all disappeared once the war happened. You know, fabric restrictions and less of a need to paint the lily, as it were, I suppose. As I said, there was not a lot of real like gossipy drama. There was, I think the press tried to allude to stuff or create stuff, but there was one story that kind of came out of it that no one seemed to dispute. And it was between Joan Crawford and Norma Shearer. They had a scene where they were delivering lines, and I guess they had done the master shot, and then they were doing the close-ups. And when it came time for Norma's close-ups, Joan Crawford was reading, like delivering her lines from across the room in a chair where she was knitting an Afghan. And while Norma was talking, you could hear the Afghan clicking, especially when Norma asked if she could move closer, like to the camera. Normally an actor stands right beside the camera so they get a sense of reacting to that person. And so Joan did. She got up, walked over to the camera, still with her knitting, and continued to clack, 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 clack knit in between takes. She even asked Joan to stop knitting, and apparently Joan pretended not to hear her or some such thing and continued to knit. So this enraged Norma Shearer so much that she asked George to send her home and read the lines to her himself. And he did. He dismissed Joan Crawford. He actually asked her to apologize, which she didn't do, and then sent her home. And it wasn't until later, I guess after she'd had time to calm down, that Joan Crawford sent a telegram apologizing for her actions. But by then, the damage was done. All right. I think that's as good as it's going to get. I'm going to do lashes and lips, and I'll be right back with the finished look. And there's the look. I would like to personally thank Likely Makeup for creating the Ugly palette. They didn't send this to me. I bought this. I was very proud to buy it, but I couldn't have bought it if they hadn't created it. And as a Canadian company, just thrilled to experience less than a week shipping for a change, as opposed to waiting for American and European companies to send me stuff. But I just can't say enough about this palette. I really do enjoy it. This is my second face with it, and I'm absolutely thrilled. Now, I will say I did have to dip into my Make and Bank palette by Morphe just for a stronger green. I just felt that the only weak spot in this is that the green in this, although gorgeous, need a little help, just a little help. I also, from Rude Cosmetics, got this fantastic blush palette, Blush Crush. I love this. This is quickly becoming my new favorite. As well, I also used Be Perfect's Shapeshifter Contour Palette. This has very much become my favorite contour palette. I can't say enough about it. I also just would like to draw attention to Mahar. I styled this myself. This is a wig that my drag daughter, Magnolia Sugarbush, sent me, and I haven't done anything with it for the longest time, and then it was like, I want to do a victory roll, and I thought this was perfect. I thought also having a retro hairdo for my review of the women would be fun, although this is a much later hairstyle than 1939 would have created. But I just want to say, if it weren't for Denise Cherneau sending me the most gorgeous wigs and me actually being able to look at how she styled them and get in there, I don't know if I could have done this. The film The Women, 1939, George Cukor directed, Norma Shearer, Joan Crawford, Rosalind Russell, just to name the top three. Really a classic. I'm not trying to tell you that it is a film that you should watch time and time again, but if you have any interest in early Hollywood, this is a must-see film. It's just because it's a who's who of who was working out of MGM at the time. And arguably, MGM had the biggest stars at this time as well. So it's a classic. The writing is scintillating. The direction is effortless. And that whole color fashion show stuck right in the middle of it is such a great snapshot of fashion at this time in America. So I highly recommend this film, at least once. At least once. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you haven't subscribed to my channel yet, why don't you do that while you're here as well? Also, I have links to Denise Cherneau, as well as my Redbubble store, my Patreon page, and on becoming a Tipperdoo if you'd like to help support this channel. So, until next time, miss me. Mwah, seriously.
Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby to get ourselves a treat.
Delicious things to eat.
The popcorn can't be beat. The sparkling drinks are just dandy. The chocolate bars and the candy. So let's all go to the lobby to get ourselves a treat. Let's all go to the lobby to get ourselves a treat.